Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is Martleby's Emporium. Have you ever seen someone else's meal get delivered at a restaurant and thought, damn, that looks good? Have you ever walked by someone's table and wanted to steal a french fry? Or nab a mozzarella stick? Ha ha ha, you rascal. Here at Martleby's, all of the customers are robots, and some are made of cardboard. Steal their food. Live out your dreams. Embrace your inner seagull. Is our business model profitable? Maybe. How else would we afford this lavish ad on a turtle's website? Martleby's Emporium, it's pretty good, and we're making money, and we're not sure how, and you're stealing french fries, maybe fajitas, cause you're a seagull. So the men's finals is here. You know, Jannik Sinner versus Carlos Alcaraz. Get used to it. I'm used to it. I'm really not complaining. These guys are playing great. They're putting on a good show. They're dismissing all the challengers. It's just really good tennis, and it sets up. This is what we were missing when the big three kind of fizzled out. Is these blockbuster finals where both players are going to bring it. Here we are at the most exciting part, and. As far as predictions, I'm a little at a loss for words. The prospect of pointing to the winner between Alcaraz and Sinner seems like a difficult one. Even though Alcaraz has won their last 5 matches, for the purpose of isolated analysis, he has to start as the favorite here. Personally, I had hinted that Sinner had a good chance of winning Roland Garros. So I'm aware that if I call for him to win here, very easy for critics to start to call me biased. It does, it looks that way, but going to try to call it how I see it and add everything up. I'm not going to ignore what I see just for the sake of avoiding criticism. But let's start with Alcaraz as the favorite and go through the pros and cons because, defending champ, he won this tournament twice and he beat a near peak Djokovic to do so. Sinner's into his first finals at Wimbledon. So, he's playing at a great level, but this is new territory for him. The Fritz match was a tremendous display of offense from Alcaraz. When he had the open court, he converted time and time again. Fritz played a great match, but just couldn't turn points around once he was in trouble. It's a movement issue. Alcaraz only served at 65%, but he's become really excellent at serving wide, and it really suits his game on grass. It suits his game against anyone, but against Fritz, it made things simple. Fritz is never really going to outrun the ball when it's heading cross court on grass. Once he's dragged wide, that's pretty much it. You drag him wide, he'll get the ball, hit a good shot, but he's not changing direction quick enough to recover to center. Sinner's obviously a much better mover than Taylor, but I still think it's the correct strategy for Carlos to get him moving early in the point. So going wide is big. I think his biggest edge on Sinner has to be in the stamina department also. So, if your strategy is moving the other guy constantly and making him lunge to the side, it could pay dividends. I don't think Carlos is ever going to be the biggest tee server at his height. So he's optimizing his choices, and choosing the strategy that best complements his game. Additionally, when Carlos does go tee now from the ad side, it tends to have an element of surprise to it. He had a handful of unreturned serves there against Fritz. Really impressive stuff from him in the semis. He only faced 2 break points the entire match. Despite Sinner being a much better returner, I think Carlos has shown an ability to boost the parts of his game he needs to in the different environments. He serves with a bunch of variety at Wimbledon, and as a result, it's tough for returners to get a good read on his patterns. Going to be interesting to see how Sinner navigates that here. For Fritz, great showing this event. The score was close and his level was good, but it's pretty clear he could feel some pressure from Alcaraz's speed. He went for a number of aggressive shots almost immediately when he had a chance to in rallies, and he made some errors. Fine with the aggressive choices, but earlier in the tournament, he was content to stay steady from the baseline. Basically, even if the shots were right for the occasion, I don't think he had the reps of playing that hyper-aggressive style, so it was a bit risky. You want to go for it, you need to elevate your game against Alcaraz, but I think Fritz's path through was similar to what I think Jannik's is, which is to maintain a level and hope that the ebbs and flows of Alcaraz's game, give you opportunities. On the court, obviously, you think you don't want to rally with Alcaraz, but then you tend not to earn those occasional rally ball errors he makes, Honestly, Alcaraz seemed like the better player throughout. Even the second set fumble where he went down love 40 at 5-6 didn't really impact the feel of who was going to win. He dropped the set, but it felt like it just made the match a little longer. It sounds funny to say Alcaraz was inevitable when he only, won the fourth set 8-6 in the tiebreak. But this was a spot where it felt like the focus and mental pressure was on Fritz the entire match. It's really hard not to blink in that spot. And I do think if Alcaraz gets in trouble, he has more gears as far as consistency. So, coming into the finals, Alcaraz is serving well. 65%, not really optimal, but he won 88% of those points. I think Sinner Sinner's going to beat Fritz in 3 or 4. So it's good for Alcaraz to do the same. Alcaraz coming to net very often, which Djokovic did to some good success against Sinner. During the rally, I think it's kind of a disaster to give Jannik a target. But, when Novak served and volleyed, he was able to catch Sinner a handful of times. You can't do it as a main strategy, but it does work. Jannik tends to try to block returns down the center a lot on grass. So even though there's pace on that shot, you can sort of be assured that you're going to get a chance to hit a volley when you move forward. So it's not a bad tactic. Obviously, Alcaraz has the more varied game here against Sinner since he uses the drop shot. But, he needs to be sharp with it. I think Sinner defended that very well against Djokovic. Not the best example of it, really, because Djokovic kind of had to bail out of some rallies, but just felt like Sinner, is moving well to that shot, and he was able to just dump it down the line, hit some good lobs, just sharp with it, As far as the Djokovic match, it's good to see Sinner finish that in straight sets. I'm not totally sold on that making him more dangerous in the finals than he was before the tournament. Novak skipping practice yesterday and the way he moved today made it seem like he was, less than 100%. He seemed to have, trouble lunging and exerting on his forehand side. And if he tweaked something in his groin, it would make sense that it would be, playable but sore the next day. So, great result for Jannik, but I don't think he crushed Djokovic. It just was Djokovic wasn't, able to compete today. Maybe Jannik wins anyway, but I'm not gonna move Sinner up in my book because of that. Djokovic even admitted in press that he didn't feel well on the court and wasn't quite able to move as well as he had hoped. He did, obviously, he's a classy guy. He gave praise to Sinner. Reporters asked if he felt unlucky because of this and, the Australian Open issues. I like his response. He said, no, this is just age and wear and tear, Impressive for him to just take it where it is and keep working. He does work hard at maintaining his health, so he'll be back. A little nugget from that press conference. He did say he didn't plan for this to be his last Wimbledon, so we're probably going to see Novak continuing to hunt Grand Slams in the future. And if he didn't have that slip late against Kobali, entirely possible this would have been a close match. So I do think there's more Grand Slam hunting in the future, and he'll do it well. Can keep making the semis in most tournaments. He made the semifinals of the last 4 Grand Slams. So, it's good for him to be on the tour too. As these next gen guys kind of fumble and rise, behind Jannik and Alcaraz, it's good to see. It's good to see Djokovic there filling that gap for a few more years at least. For Sinner, comprehensive win. He extends rallies in a really calm way. And he's always willing to put the ball back in play, whatever pace is possible. It doesn't matter if he's off balance or awkward. He just wants to play tennis. He just wants to win. It created a lot of pressure on Djokovic, who went for some bailout drop shots, some net rush tactics that didn't really totally pan out. Obviously, Novak not at his best, so the analysis here is somewhat moot. Sinner played a nearly perfect match, but it doesn't mean he's going to do that against Alcaraz. For both players, I think for Sinner and Alcaraz, it's a much more difficult opponent, and the easy routes to victory are just gone. This is a match where both have to play their best throughout, and I think the title goes to whoever manages the situation and executes the best. I do really like the way that Sinner establishes that he's going to stay in the rally as long as it takes, and I think I'd point to the Rublev match maybe as a good sign for him here. Sinner has a similar level of pace and weight on his shots as Andre, and Alcaraz had some timing issues in that match. Made a handful of errors trying to trade with him. It's really easy to go back and forth with analysis here. As much as I want to point to Sinner's hitting, as the best Alcaraz has faced, this is also the last round of the tournament. So, there's no holding back from Carlos. He didn't need, his best tennis earlier. And against his biggest rival and in the final round, his focus and effort level are going to be at their highest. Errors that are there in a safe situation against Rublev, it's mean to call Rublev a safe situation, but Alcaraz is a heavy favorite there given their season so far. So, those errors don't have to arrive here at all. That being said, the base of the court is chipped up, and one thing Sinner does really well from the baseline is infuse a little bit of extra pace on the ball when he's going cross court. He doesn't go for the winner, but he just leans on the shot a little bit, and it can make the ball skip, it can make the ball bounce a bit funny on grass. On clay, this isn't really going to bother Carlos much. The depth is good, but leaning on the shot doesn't really cause as many bad bounces. So I think this is going to raise Sinner's average hitting, as far as how often it scores, a bit more than it did in Paris. And safely, too. It's not a shot he has to, go too crazy with. Sinner reported he's 100% as far as the elbow, and the last 2 rounds do look like his elbow's fine. He had treatment in the quarters, but, against Djokovic, he was fine. I'm still going to raise it again here, though, even though it wasn't an issue last round. And the reason why I'd say is Alcaraz's weight of shot. If your forearm is sore, trading with Alcaraz for 4 or more hours is going to make it worse. It's a lot of shock. It's a lot of impact. And both of these players, Alcaraz and Sinner have proven in the finals that they're exerting to such a degree, and it's somewhat new, even though they have experience in Grand Slams each. But, they're exerting to the limit. So, things can happen. I think the Roland Garros final saw Sinner, obviously clay is different than grass, but saw Sinner start out a bit sharper and then his legs faded. I don't think that happens here. But there was a big lapse in the third set against Djokovic. Obviously, it's hard to beat anyone, 0-0-0. Even if you're playing your best, at some point you're going to push your limits as far as accuracy and shot selection and start to miss. You just kind of Pac-Man off one side of the screen and come up with errors. We saw Anisimova have this issue late in the second set against Pavlyuchenkova. Just a little bit too many opportunities, and you start pulling the trigger too early. Additionally, if you're extremely solid, that perfect pattern of shots can sometimes become predictable, and as your opponent changes their game, you might play into their hands a bit. It's just really hard to blank anyone in tennis, which is one of the reasons we'll see players win a lopsided first set and then go down a quick break in the second. It's just that focus level and how much you can maintain for how long. Also, the better you're playing, the more you're freeing your opponent up in a way. Once you're going to lose no matter what, you're just going for the biggest shots that you can. You're going to increase your level to basically until you find your peak, and that peak can sometimes be a little better than the second set doldrums. Obviously in the finals, you don't expect that, but it still was a lapse, basically, is my point. The third set lapse against Djokovic is one I expect Alcaraz to benefit from. I'm not saying he'll do it if it happens. I'm saying I think it'll come. Alcaraz has more highs and lows during a match, despite maintaining a high level. When Sinner's playing stingy from the baseline and serving well, I think he's a point or two better each set. But the moment that fades, I think there's opportunity for a letdown. I think, Alcaraz's forehand becomes a big problem for people once they're a little bit flat. Right around the middle of the match is when I think Alcaraz is going to thrive because, that forehand technique is really useful. He just booms the ball, different heights, different paces. It becomes a lot of footwork for the opponent. Early in the match, you can deal with it fine, and Alcaraz will be the more error-prone player. But, as things drag on, it's a lot of work to just deal with that. And it's similar to Nadal. They can rip that forehand with just a beautiful, fluid technique. It's hard to read, and it has a little bit of extra pace on it, I'd say, at times, compared to Sinner's. Sinner's a counterpuncher too, so any fatigue is going to cost him control. And even though Sinner moves much better than Fritz, you're not really winning Wimbledon with defense. So when you lose control, it's a problem. One reason I'd point to that Alcaraz is gaining crowd support is because he crushes the ball in spectacular fashion when he has the open court. So as we saw it in Paris, it'll be a little different here, but. It's a mental battle to not feel like he's just going to crush winners at any moment when you're playing him when he starts to, because he can. And, him and his team, have given him, well, he can't give himself the green light, but he has the green light to go for the shots he wants to go for. They trust him and he can produce. So going to be tricky to watch, Alcaraz crush winners and not get a bit mental about needing to put the ball in tougher spots. I do think conditions help Sinner a bit in the respect, as much as I like watching Alcaraz crush winners, I think at Roland Garros it takes multiple quality shots to hit through Alcaraz. On grass, we've seen, almost every player he's played score on him except Cam Norrie. There's some weird and speculative intangibles here. One, I guess, is experience. Alcaraz has won this tournament 2 years in a row. He's going to be very comfortable here. It's home. The crowd is behind him. He's gotten to the finals completely fresh, and he's playing an opponent that he basically just yoinked a huge title from in Paris. He's free rolling here. He's been through tougher battles, I think, here in the past than Sinner. Not this season, but in prior Wimbledons. For Jannik, he's in his first Wimbledon finals, and that can sometimes be tricky to navigate as far as nerves, when it comes to decision making. The second thing I'd point to, which goes in maybe Sinner's favor, is the baggage from Roland Garros. When you lose a big title, it stays with you until you either win an equally large title or until you beat that opponent who snagged you. And I'll tell you, when you play that opponent again, you are easily the most motivated and focused that you can be. It's the same as, the last breakup can hurt, but once you meet someone else, it's like, wait, no, actually I'm fine. It's easy. It's easy to say Jannik is very professional. The way he acts is great. He's very composed on the court and he's very professional, but you can guarantee that he wants to get that win back, So, the Alcaraz dominance can continue, but at the highest level of racket sports, it is really difficult to shut anyone out, and grass court is an offensive thing. So all the grit and endurance you want doesn't really have the hugest effect here. It'll win you a few points. A few points could be the difference, but this is going to be a shootout. I think Sinner has made significant improvements to his strength and consistency over the past season. So, even though it's 5 in a row for Alcaraz, I really would only point maybe to the Roland Garros win as a good indicator of how this matchup will go. If you want to use outdated data, it's fine. The trend is, it's hard to call for someone winning when they've been losing. But if you want to go back, we'll go back and grab the 2022 Wimbledon result, where Sinner beat Alcaraz in 4. I would discard that. I'd discard, 2 or 3 of the 5 in a row for Alcaraz. Alcaraz, I think, still slight favorite here, but I do think Sinner has made progress. As much as Alcaraz has, Sinner has kept even. So back to my point, Sinner has, an opportunity here to get revenge almost immediately. I think the only moment he'll get rattled by here is if another similar situation looms, like Roland Garros. If he has a lead, starts to feel that fatigue, Carlos starts to deal with his stuff better. I think it'll be tough to manage. It's possible, but I think it's significantly less likely on grass. For the most part, this tournament, after any 20-shot rally, that longest rally of the match pop-up is appearing on the screen. It's just been, it's short points on grass. So I think you can expect 3 or 4 hours of extremely high-level tennis here with both players playing well. Sinner's not terribly experienced on grass, but still the conditions are better for him in the matchup than clay. Saying this will be closer than Roland Garros is tricky too, because, only a single tiebreaker separated them in that final scoreline. I do think Alcaraz up a break in the 5th there was further away than maybe the match ended. I thought Sinner was a bit lucky to get the break back on his last legs, but still, it really, really close stuff. At the end of all this chatter, I do still think Alcaraz is a slight favorite on paper, but it's going to require a level that he hasn't displayed yet this tournament. The way he played against Fritz was tremendous, and I think that would send him into a 5th set with Sinner. So, I think Sinner's very polite and pressed, but he's been thinking about defeating Alcaraz most of every single day for the better part of a month. It just, it adds up to a good spot where Sinner is even though he shouldn't be. This is going to be a classic. It's another even spot for me where, the player who wins the big points will win. A single error in the tiebreaker could be the difference. You drop one set and later on you get one unlucky let cord and that's it, and it sticks with you. I think these guys know they're going to play each other for a long time, so the losses and wins won't mean, a lot. But this is a really big one because if Alcaraz wins here, Sinner almost has to win the U.S. Open to sort of establish that he's still, in the mix. All the losses are close, but you don't want to take this many in a row, period. And, now that he's made these improvements, you want to see, the results from the improvements. If you make me actually pick, I guess I have to. I actually might like Sinner. I think just a couple points on it. I think he has a small edge on fast surfaces against Alcaraz as far as his ground strokes and his timing. I think reducing Alcaraz's ability to defend and increasing Sinner's gas tank because the rallies are short will let him, break this streak of Alcaraz victories. Sinner also serves a tiny bit better and just a little bit more disciplined. So, I think Sinner in 4 or 5 sets is what I'm expecting. And yeah, just really close. To be honest, I would skip the finals if I could, as far as picking a side. I don't think there's a side you pick here where you feel, terribly smart even after they win, because the other players are right there. And it's for this specific matchup, I'd say that, it's just not one where either player has a huge edge. So heading into the women's, pretty surprising finals here. If you told me 2 weeks ago Anisimova would be playing in the finals against Iga Swiatek, I'd probably like Anisimova's side. She serves a bit better. She hits bigger and flatter, and her offense has been in really good form. Yes, Swiatek made the finals in Bad Homburg, but she didn't really defeat anyone too heavily involved in the Wimbledon title conversation. She beat Alexandrova, but I expect her to maybe make the second week of something like this, not to win a title. What's shifted since then, and what makes me think Anisimova is in trouble, is the style of tennis Iga's playing right now. She's been moving her opponents in an extremely efficient and inevitable way, and Anisimova's lateral movement is the big hole in her game. Coincidentally, maybe luckily, Swiatek's biggest weakness is also Anisimova's strength. Iga tries to hug the baseline, and she can get rushed into errors on fast surfaces by powerful players. So there are a few big questions here, I think, that'll get answered really early in the match. I'm just going to list them because probably get jumbled from here and intermixed. Is Swiatek able to time Anisimova's power? Can Anisimova defend against Swiatek in baseline rallies? And is Anisimova going to be able to make inroads on the Swiatek serve? So the first one, is Swiatek able to time Anisimova's power? If so, it's a long day for Anisimova. She has a good serve, but hasn't really been at a high enough percentage to keep Iga from playing tennis. She was at 63% against Sabalenka, and that's good, but most of her matches she's been in the low 50s. Her only 2 matches actually in the 60s are both at 63%, which is kind of funny, but doesn't really give her a boost here. It's a big moment. It's hard to serve well in a big moment. The question of Anisimova's power versus Swiatek's timing is a bit of a mystery, honestly, because, Iga has had trouble against Ostapenko, Collins, these type of players, but has also had success against them recently. I think that the second question of Anisimova's movement against Iga's ground strokes is one that you can answer. I don't think Amanda moves well enough to deal with Swiatek's offense right now. I think Iga's offense is also not particularly risky for her. She's taken the ball early, and she's always been excellent at creating short angles. She holds and disguises her swing on both wings extremely well. So I think it's just going to be really tough for Amanda. You can guess, but Iga can see you moving early. Iga knows where you are. She can create the angles, and just not really pressure for her to miss, if she knows that you're not going to get there. There's going to be unforced errors, and Iga overcooks some forehands, obviously, especially, down the line. But I think Iga has shown a recognition that position is hard to recover on grass. And she's been really patient about finding the open court without risking too much. She knows she's going to get there, and it's giving her good focus. I would point maybe to the Fritz Alcaraz match as something that kind of illustrates the point here. You can be a great technical player and great striker, but being a step slow can sometimes be something you can't overcome. Not all doom and gloom for Anisimova, because these two questions are kind of intertwined, and the answer to the power dynamic is just not really clear. I'm sure everyone would like to say, yeah, I can deal with her ball and just magically do so, but so far in the tournament, no one has. All right, Anisimova's power can legitimately save her from having to play defense, and it has here this year. And she's not unable to run either. It's just you're not going to look for her to outlast someone on defense here. It's not her game plan, and it's going to be an issue. She hits the ball incredibly sharp and really can take the racket out of anyone's hands. So far, that has worked. Against Sabalenka, Anisimova won a shootout of really high caliber. And while Swiatek's semifinal win was comprehensive and a much cleaner scoreline, it was against a lower caliber opponent. So, Swiatek has had trouble with Sabalenka herself and some other big hitters on fast surfaces. Grass is kind of fast, so big question mark there. But I do think it gets answered early, and I think there will be pressure that builds on Anisimova to convert as the match goes on. I think her service games where it's tight are going to seem more like she has to hit big shots, and Swiatek's going to be able to maintain her same game. The third question I have is how Anisimova makes inroads into the Swiatek serve. Iga's been really successful this week hitting body serves, and Anisimova can get a bit tied up on these. Swiatek's serve could always revert against a really aggressive returner. She's not above nerves. Both players in their first Wimbledon title final. I think you're going to see a lot of deep breaths, a lot of looks to the box after errors, after double faults. Just a really stressful situation where every point will seem like it was the biggest one the moment it's over. You screw up and then you go, oh no, I wanted to. And it's especially palpable at Wimbledon, I think, just because of the history, just because of the environment, and because it's a surface they don't play that often. I think if they played 3 months of grass a year, this would just be another tournament, but it's something you don't get back quickly. We saw Cilic struggle with anxiety before the finals against Federer, and Jabeur had some similar issues in her first Wimbledon final. So it just can be, it can be a lot. For me, I think Anisimova displayed the highest level in the tournament leading up to the semis, but Swiatek looked scary good. We can put an asterisk there because Bencic isn't really a big threat for her stylistically. Iga does everything a bit bigger and faster than Bencic, and that includes serving at this point. She's serving really well these past 2 weeks. My problem is that this appears to be like a stylistic issue for Anisimova here. Yeah, Swiatek has had huge problems with powerful, aggressive returners like Ostapenko in the past, but this week she played Samsonova, she played Towson, she played Collins, and rendered all of them pretty inert. Somewhere McNally is wondering if she would have been here, if she could have squeaked by. That's the only player so far to take a set off of Swiatek. The fact that she's dispatching big offenses makes her a fair favorite here. It just seems like her timing is really good right now, and that she's not really the flustered version of Swiatek who stubbornly hugs the baseline and spews errors. That we saw that a bunch last season. Not a bunch, she's obviously always in the top 5 in the world, but just seems like her timing is really solid here, and that makes her a different player. You can't expect players to just fall apart, especially someone as professional as Swiatek. She's in good form, and she's been working on her service technique for a while, so if it's locked in, I think it'll stay locked in. I do have Anisimova winning in the pre-tournament bracket I filled out, so I'll be cheering, but I think Swiatek looks like the better player here. Just that the style matchup is it's just easier for her to convert here. There are more ways, and I think Anisimova has to sprint. The Sabalenka win is a huge one for Anisimova. It's amazing to see her enjoying being on the court again. But I think that's that's a matchup she's always going to dominate because Sabalenka's a little bit slow and a slightly less consistent offense than Amanda. It's the same reason she can do well against Zhang. Swiatek in 3 is kind of what I expect here. I think Anisimova and Iga are meeting at the right time for Iga. I think Anisimova would win this, most of the time, but this week Swiatek just looks sharper with her timing. This is actually their first meeting, so I don't expect either player to read their opponent easily. It's one of the reasons I was saying 3, maybe more than 2. Swiatek looks really sharp, but I think Anisimova has started every match really well and had a good shot selection. I think she's relatively unplayable with the ball in her backhand. But Swiatek's task seems straightforward. She just has to move Anisimova. She just has to extend rallies and look to drag the match out. Just kind of have to ride out that wave of unplayable tennis from Amanda, and just rely on stamina and having the edge and movement as the match drags on. So I do like Swiatek in 3 there. Could be really close, with 2 brand new players in a final. Anything can happen. I might pop up a quick recap video after this. My wrist is still pretty trucked. Looks like I may have done some actual damage. So I won't be back to write-ups for a little while. But, appreciate you for listening. Head on down to Martleby's if you're looking, for some good old-fashioned food theft. And I'll see you around.